There are a few things that delight me more than putting a copy of A Discovery of Witches in an unsuspecting customer's hands. It's particularly endurable to do it here at Politics and Prose, where our customers are some of the most well-read people in the country. But one of the most wonderful parts of being an independent bookseller is that our customers trust us to guide them to the books they'll love, even if they never would have picked it up themselves. And there are so many booksellers all over who love the All Souls trilogies, but know, Ms. Harkness, that the P&P booksellers have been utter fanatics since your first book, as The Discovery of Witches, hit the shelves of that trilogy. What is not to love about it? The true challenge of writing fantasy archetypes such as vampires or witches is reinvention and creating a new mythology on the bones of an old one. Colson Whitehead reinvented the zombie genre with his novel Zone 1, which you haven't read, it's fantastic. Glenn Duncan reinvented the werewolf genre with The Last Werewolf. But Ms. Harkness took her reinvention even further and created a world beautifully intricate and rife with inner politics, dangers, secrets, and academia, and wound it around a rich, very adult love story, fantastical as it is. Diana and Matthew are complicated characters, sometimes endearing, sometimes mystifying, and often infuriatingly stubborn and ridiculous. Miss Harkness's own academic background and interests shine in each book. And honestly, I could go on and on about them, but you didn't come here to hear me talk. So please join me in welcoming the wonderful Deborah Harkness.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody here at the store who have put on this great event for us. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a Friday night in the summer when the humidity is broken. As somebody from Philadelphia, I know how rare these moments are and how really for a lot of you this meant that you were not able to sit on your back deck or patio for the first time and actually enjoy the summertime, because I know it's been either freezing, raining, or brutally humid. So I thank you all for choosing to be here anyway. So first of all, there's going to be a quiz. It's the only quiz of the evening, and it's really easy. How many of you have not yet read or finished the Book of Life?
Don't hate me, Joe.
No, I don't hate you, Gretchen. Okay, but there's a fair number of hands. So I just want to remind you, it is impossible for me to do a book reading without any spoilers, because it's a book reading and there have to be a few because I have to read from the book. But at the same time, if during the Q&A period, if you could resist asking questions about the events of the last 2 pages of the book, your fellow audience members would be oh so grateful to you for doing that. And you can always ask me up here in the signing line if you have a question that's about, how the book actually ends. That way we'll all have a good time and nobody will leave feeling like their entire trilogy experience was ruined by finding out in advance exactly how it ends. So I think it's fair to say, however, we can start with a little bit of an overview of the series. So the All Souls Trilogy has really been a trilogy about 3 main characters. And those 3 main characters are Diana Bishop, a Yale University historian who is a student and scholar of alchemy and who is at Oxford University doing research on sabbatical. And she is, in addition to being a Yale University historian, she is also a witch. She's the last in a long line of witches that goes all the way back to Bridget Bishop, the first woman executed for the crime of witchcraft in Salem Village in 1692. And Diana does not want to go into the family business, which is magic. So for any of you who may have not wanted to own a hardware store or be a lawyer or whatever it might be, Diana's in the same position. It's just that her family business happens to be magic and not bolts or, charters and deeds and torts. Good, exactly the word I was looking for. The second main character is Matthew Clairmont. Matthew Clairmont is a scientist, a geneticist working at Oxford University, a sort of tall, dashing young man in his mid to late 30s, who just so happens to be a 1,500-year-old vampire, as well as being a geneticist and scientist. And the final main character for me is not a person. So alas, it's not Isabeau, which I know is a favorite, and it's also not Gallowglass. I know, it's it's sad. You were all very fickle about this. I have to say, it was Matthew, Matthew, Matthew for a long time, and then suddenly the tables have all turned in this very surprising way. True. But the third character for me was and has always been Ashmole 782. The mysterious alchemical manuscript at the center of the All Souls Trilogy that both Diana and Matthew want for very different reasons, and which is connected to them in very different ways. And what the trilogy really pivots on is not only their search, but also figuring out why. What they realize is that so many other creatures want this book too. And Ashmole 782 is a book that I like to describe as a book that everybody wants, but no one even knows what's in it or understands it, which is, I think, a common problem in life today. People want things and they don't even know why they want it or how they want it. They just know that they want it. So when we started out the trilogy back in A Discovery of Witches, if you can think of it, the way that I thought about the trilogy was that at the beginning we started with a fairly tight focus on our three main characters, especially on Diana. We saw the world through her eyes. We had the experiences she had. We had some limited experiences looking at the world from Matthew's point of view. And that's because A Discovery of Witches follows the first 40 days of their relationship. If you think the action of the book takes place over 40 days, not a whole lot of time. So basically, this is that lovely time in a couple's relationship when you love everything your partner says. You think that her chili is amazing. You think baseball is great. For that first 40 days, that's what we're dealing with in A Discovery of Witches. And if you think about it even more deeply, you might remember they hardly ever even go outdoors in that first book. It's a very kind of insular story with a few close family members. Then in the second book, Shadow of Night, Diana and Matthew go back to the past. They go back to 1590. And that was a deliberate move on my part because I'm a historian and I believe that the past is meaningful and relevant to the present and to the future. And I believe that you can learn things in the past that are applicable to problems in the future. And I say that to my students with kind of a waggy finger at lecture. And I thought, no, I'm going to try to do what you're supposed to do as a novelist. I'm going to try to show it instead of just say, this is important and you shouldn't ignore it. And so I wanted Diana and Matthew to go back to the past so that they could learn things about themselves, each other, and Ashmole 782 that literally they could not have learned in the present moment. Also, it gave me an opportunity to widen that focus a bit so that instead of us just seeing Diana and Matthew, we got that next wonderful stage of a relationship when you start having to be a couple amongst old friends and family who have their own narratives and storylines and expectations for you. And you start thinking, really, these are your friends and this is your family? We can, and again, you know, you don't need to be a vampire or a witch to experience that moment in a relationship. Well, in the Book of Life, the third and final book of the trilogy, what we get to see is that pool of light grow even further, to see Matthew and Diana return to the present, not just as a couple, but as the heart of a new family, and to see that family sort of start to move about in the world and make a place for itself in the world, which is, again, kind of a typical narrative arc. I really wanted in this story to explore more than just, you know, will they or won't they fall in love? Because let's face it, the minute Matthew saw Diana in the library, you knew they were going to be together, right? Okay, so we didn't need to spend 800, 900 pages like wondering about that. I thought, let's get on to the good stuff. Let's get on to how are these people actually going to stay together, which I think is one of the greatest mysteries of life, right? Is how does a couple sort of survive? And it survives by being able to move through all of these steps. So when we come to the Book of Life, one of the things that was difficult for me writing the Book of Life was that I had to join up two separate stories. Really, the Book of Life is the continuation of Discovery of Witches because it's in the present, and it picks up with all of the people that Matthew and Diana left behind in the present. and it needed to be the continuation of Shadow of Night at the same time. And that proved to be kind of difficult. It took me a long time to launch it off the ground. And I often felt like I was trying to launch a 747 with a rubber band, because it was just like the accumulated weight of these two storylines made it really, really tough. But I finally figured out that the only way to do it was to kind of expand that focus off of just the two of them and to bring in the rest of the family and give them voices. And so quite soon after Matthew and Diana return home, you know, they come home expecting a quite straightforward, joyful welcome, and they discover quite quickly that one of their beloved family members, Diana's aunt, one of the women who raised her, Emily Mather, has died. And that sends Diana, quite understandably, into grief. It also sends Matthew into overprotective mode, not surprisingly. And amidst all of that, though, you know, there needed to be a little bit of room for other reunions and for a little bit of what my grandmother used to call leavening in the lump, you know, a little bit of joy in it all. And so we also get to meet up with some people we may have last seen in the last pages of Shadow of Night, but a person who has been hanging around for an awfully long time waiting for Diana and Matthew to return, and that is Gallowglass. So I just want to read from you from the second chapter, when Matthew and Gallowglass meet up for the first time to have a serious conversation after their return, and they meet up because Gallowglass is trying to track down a wayward familiar flying around Set-Tour. So Matthew raced down the curving stone staircase that wound between his tower rooms at Set-Tour and the main floor of the chateau. He avoided the slippery spot on the 30th tread and the rough patch on the 17th, where Baldwin's sword had bashed the edge during one of their arguments. Matthew had built the tower addition as his private refuge, a place apart from the relentless busyness that always surrounded Philippe and Isabeau. Vampire families were large and noisy, with two or more bloodlines coming uncomfortably together and trying to live as one happy pack. This seldom happened with predators, even those who walked on two legs and lived in fine houses. As a result, Matthew's tower was designed primarily for defense. It had no doors to muffle a vampire's stealthy approach, and no way out except for the way you came in. His careful arrangements spoke volumes about his relationships with his brothers and sisters. Tonight, the tower's isolation seemed confining, a far cry from the busy life he and Diana had created in Elizabethan London, surrounded by family and friends. Matthew's job as a spy for the Queen had been challenging but rewarding. From his former seat on the congregation, he had managed to save a few witches from hanging. Diana had begun the lifelong process of growing into her powers as a witch. They'd even taken in 2 orphan children and given them a chance for a better future. Their life in the 16th century had not always been easy, but their days had been filled with love and the sense of hope that followed Diana wherever she went. Here at Set-Tour, they seemed surrounded on all sides by death and de Clairmonts. Gallowglass was crooning a sea shanty in the chateau's great hall. For reasons Matthew couldn't fathom, every other verse was punctuated by expletives and ultimatums. After a moment of indecision, Matthew's curiosity won out. Flipping fire, Drake. Gallowglass had one of the pikes down from the cache of weapons by the entrance and was waving it slowly in the air. Farewell and adieu to you ladies of Spain. Get your arse down here, or Granny will poach you in white wine and feed you to the dogs. For we've received orders for to sail to Old England. What are you thinking, flying around this house like a demented parakeet? And we may never see you fair ladies again. What the hell are you doing? Matthew demanded. Gallowglass turned wide blue eyes on Matthew. The younger man was wearing a black T-shirt adorned with a skull and crossbones. Something had slashed the back, rending it from left shoulder to right hip. The holes in his nephew's jeans looked to be the result of wear, not war, and his hair was shaggy, even by Gallowglassian standards. Isabeau had taken to calling him Sir Vagabond, but this had done little to improve his grooming. Trying to catch your wife's wee beastie. Gallowglass made a sudden upward thrust with the pike. There was a shriek of surprise, followed by a hail of pale green scales that shattered like isinglass when they hit the floor. The blonde hair on Gallowglass's forearms shimmered with their iridescent green dust. He sneezed. Cora, Diana's fire drake familiar, was clinging to the minstrel's gallery with her talons, chattering madly and clacking her tongue. She waved hello to Matthew with her barbed tail, piercing a priceless tapestry depicting a unicorn in a garden. Matthew winced. I had her cornered up in the chapel by the altar, but Cora is a cunning lass, Gallowglass said, with a touch of pride. She was hiding atop Granddad's tomb, her wings spread wide. I mistook her for an effigy. Now look at her, up in the rafters, vainglorious as the devil, and twice as much trouble. Why, she's put her tail through one of Isabeau's favorite draperies. Granny is going to have a stroke. If Cora is anything like her mistress, cornering her won't end well, Matthew said mildly. Try reasoning with her instead. Oh, aye, that works very well with Auntie Diana, Gallowglass sniffed. Whatever possessed you to let Cora out of your sight? The more active the fire drake is, the calmer Diana seems, Matthew said. Perhaps, but Cora is hell on the decor. She broke one of Granny's Sèvres vases this afternoon. Oh, so long as it wasn't one of the blue ones with the lion's heads that Philippe gave her, I shouldn't worry. Matthew groaned when he saw Gallowglass's expression. Merde. That was Hélène's response, too. Gallowglass leaned on his pike. Well, Isabel will have to make do with one less piece of pottery, Matthew said. Cora may be a nuisance, but Diana is sleeping soundly for the first time since we came home. Oh, well, that's all right then. Just tell Isabeau that Cora's clumsiness is good for the grandbabies. Granny will hand over her vases as sacrificial offerings. Meanwhile, I'll try to keep the flying termagant entertained so Auntie can sleep. How are you going to do that? Matthew asked with skepticism. Sing to her, of course. Gallowglass looked up. Cora cooed at his renewed attention, stretching her wings a bit farther so they caught the light from the torches stuck into brackets along the walls. Taking this as an encouraging sign, Gallowglass drew a deep breath and began another booming ballad. My head turns round, I'm in a flame, I love like any dragon. Say, would you know my mistress's name? Cora clacked her teeth in approval. Gallowglass grinned and began to move the pike like a metronome. He waggled his eyebrows at Matthew before singing his next lines. I sent her trinkets without end, gems, pearls to make her civil, till having nothing more to send, I sent her to the devil. Good luck, Matthew murmured, sincerely hoping that Cora didn't understand the lyrics. So, my process of writing this trilogy, you know, when I think back to those moments in 2008 when I was in Puerto Vallarta celebrating Mom's birthday, and we were in we were in a monsoon because no one told us that you were going to experience monsoon-like conditions in Mexico in early September. I was at the airport bookstore, and there was a whole wall of books that were about shapeshifters, werewolves, vampires, witches, all sorts of supernatural creatures. And I just looked at that wall of well-dressed vampires and witches driving fancy cars with obviously hot romantic interests. And I thought, if there really are these creatures, what in the world do they do for a living? And how do they date? What are the practicalities of their life? And I just couldn't stop thinking about that. But as I went on, I really did sort of, end up, I think, taking the parts of my life as a teacher and a scholar, as a professor of history, something I've been doing for a very long time, and sort of twining them all up together with this sort of question that was running in my head in order to produce this thing that has become the All Souls Trilogy. When I started it, I certainly had no expectation that anybody but members of my family would ever read it. I certainly never expected to be here at Politics and Prose talking to all of you about it. But it was an opportunity for me to see if I could kind of get across some of the things that I think are important about history and knowledge and learning without that sort of waggy finger of being a professor. So in terms of being a historian, I wanted to really make the past come alive. And vampires were a great vehicle for doing that. Now, we're not talking about vampires who were made in the 20th century. Matthew's 1,500 years old. There was no way as a historian I was going to waste the opportunity to talk about history by having someone who'd lived for a long time and then making them sort of, made into a vampire in 1930. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but if I was going to have history to play with, I wanted a big playpen. So, two of the best examples I have for how I did that was I never made up anything I didn't have to. I tried to put as much real history into the books as I could. So first example, for those of you who don't know, Ashmole 782 is a real manuscript at the Bodleian, and it's really missing. And I first encountered it in Oxford in 1990 or so when I called it up, and I got a note that said, it's missing, we can't give this to you. And it was on my list of books I wanted to look at. And so it went back into this sort of file cabinet in the back of my head full of things that bother me, like things that just niggle at me and won't let go. And it was a real scholarly sort of source of frustration. So when I was because it was this book that I wanted to look at that I thought might have something to offer me, and I couldn't see it. And so when I was thinking about what might bring a witch and a vampire together, I thought, well, maybe a book. And I thought, ooh, I'll use that I won't make up a missing manuscript. I've got a perfectly good missing manuscript to talk about. And so you know as much about Ashmole 782 as I do, which is its call number and its description and the title in the catalog. And it's still missing even today. No one has still found it. I know. Every time I get a note from anybody at the Bodleian, that's what I expect they're going to tell me, and it's never that. It's always something else. The other thing that I did was to incorporate people that I knew from the past. And the leading example of that is Matthew Royden. So again, for those of you who don't know, Matthew Royden was a real person. He really was a friend of Raleigh and Sidney and Spencer and Harriet and above all Marlowe. He really was a spy for the Queen. People say to me, why does he have to know absolutely everybody? He's like the Forrest Gump of vampires, is how somebody once described him to me. And I said, it's not my fault. He really knew all those people, but I took the whole package. I met Matthew Royden when I was writing my master's thesis on a poem written in 1594 called The Shadow of Night by a man named George Chapman. So some of that might sound familiar to you. But it was dedicated to Matthew Royden. And so I went out and tried to find out everything about him. Thought, well, this is going to be easy. He's friends with George Chapman and Marlowe. There'll be 12 biographies. No, I couldn't find out where he was born, when he was born, if he went to school, where he would have gone to school if he did, if he was married, or even where and when he died. And I thought, how can you know every famous person? And I can't find this information. So again, when I was thinking about what vampires would be like, I thought they'd be like aggravating Mr. Royden, who popped up in 1586, wrote a funeral poem for Philip Sidney, and was like this meteor who just flashed across the sky for 7 years and then disappeared. To the point where when Christopher Marlowe's inquest at his death, when they were asking witnesses, do you know why this fight broke out? Do you know what happened to Marlowe? They all said, we have no idea. If you could find Matthew Royden, he would probably know, but we can't, nobody's seen him. We don't know where he is. And I thought, that's a vampire for you, right? Explains a lot. So again, a source of historical frustration sort of alchemically transformed into the stuff of fiction. As a teacher of history, of course, what I most want is for my students to be curious about the past and to wonder about it. So I tried very hard in this series of books to leave eminently Googleable bits of information. I teach the Google age, right? I can literally be speaking in my lecture hall and I'll say something about so-and-so, and suddenly this voice will pop up and say, they had 3 brothers named Mark, John, and William. And I'm like, are you on Google while I'm talking? And the answer is yes. And so there's no point in fighting this. Instead, let's embrace it. And it means that you can look things up, and it can be a great thing. It's like sort of what happened when we were children and we were told to go look it up in the encyclopedia. Anybody remember that? So I really wanted people who were reading not to know when I was making things up and when I was telling the truth, and to have to sort of figure that out for themselves. This is actually quite a good life skill, even if it's not in a vampire and witch book, to sort of try to think, fact or fiction? Fact or fiction? And how could I figure out what the answer to that might be? So I was telling my students that you know, this was a treasure hunt for them to go on to read this book. And my students explained to me actually that they're called Easter eggs now, because it's about video games, and that what I'd done is sort of constructed a textual video game where they could open these Easter eggs. Easter eggs, treasure hunt, whatever you want to call it. It was a way, again, of sort of getting that kind of critical response going, even in a work of fiction. And finally, you know, as a historian, one of the things that I really treasure is doing research. It's one of my favorite parts about being a historian, is going into an archive like the Bodleian, going in and trying to piece together a story from bits and bobs of past lives and texts, some of which have been partially destroyed, some of which have been struck out, some of which have been faded, and they have to bring the Thames Valley ultraviolet machine into the Bodleian so you can see what's underneath the layers. And you know, for me, again, being a researcher is an enormous privilege. It's also, of course, a great challenge, because as a historian, what I know is that the artifacts of the past can never really tell us the full story. And I am going to read to you, sort of as the final part of the reading selection, a bit from a little further in the book, a few pages down from what I read before. And it's a place where Diana, having come back to the present and having met not only up with Gallowglass, but also with Matthew's brother Baldwin, is sort of facing the reality of this sort of new situation they find themselves in, coming back as a couple, and is also confronted with the bits and pieces of her past, because this really sort of captures a little bit of what I feel like sometimes when I'm in the archives. All right. "What are we going to do?" I said, still trying to regain my equilibrium after Baldwin's sudden appearance. A gentle cough announced a new presence in the room and kept Matthew from responding. "I'm sorry to interrupt, my lord." Alan Lemaire, Philippe de Clairmont's one-time squire, stood in the doorway to the library. He was holding an ancient coffer with the initials PC picked out on the top in silver studs, and a small ledger bound in green buckram. His salt and pepper hair and kind expression were the same as when I'd first met him in 1590. Like Matthew and Gallowglass, he was a fixed star in my universe of change. "What is it, Hélène?" Matthew asked. "I have business with Madame de Clairmont," Hélène replied. "Business?" Matthew frowned. "Can it wait?" "I'm afraid not," Hélène said apologetically. "This is a difficult time, I know, my lord, but Sir Philippe was adamant that Madame de Clairmont be given her things as soon as possible." Hélène ushered us back up to our tower. What I saw on Matthew's desk drove the events of the past hour completely from my mind and left me breathless. A small book bound in brown leather, an embroidered sleeve threadbare with age, priceless jewels, pearls and diamonds and sapphires, a golden arrowhead on a long chain, a pair of miniatures, their bright surfaces as fresh as the day they were painted, letters tied with a faded carnation ribbon, a silver rat trap, tarnish clinging to the fine engraving, a gilded astronomical instrument fit for an emperor, a wooden box carved by a wizard out of a branch from a rowan tree. The collection of objects didn't look like much, but they held enormous significance, for they represented the past 8 months of our lives. I picked up the small book with a trembling hand and flipped it open. Matthew had given it to me soon after we'd arrived at his mansion in Woodstock. In the autumn of 1590, the book's binding had been fresh and the pages creamy. Today, the leather was speckled and the paper yellowed with age. In the past, I'd tucked the book away on the high shelf in the old lodge, but a book plate inside me told me it was now the property of a library in Seville. The call mark, Manuscrito Gonsalves 4890, was inked onto the flyleaf. Someone, Gallowglass no doubt, had removed the first page. Once it had been covered with my tentative attempts to record my name. The blots from that missing leaf had seeped through to the page below, but the list I'd made of the Elizabethan coins in circulation in 1590 was still legible. I flipped through the rest of the pages, remembering the headache cure I'd attempted to master in a futile attempt to appear a proper Elizabethan housewife. My diary of daily happenings brought back bittersweet memories of our time with the School of Night. It's a miracle anything survived. How did you manage to keep all this hidden from me for so many years? Matthew picked up the silver rat trap. He'd teased me when I'd commissioned one of London's most expensive clockmakers to make the mechanism to catch the rats prowling in our attics in the Blackfriars. Monsieur Valin had designed it to resemble a cat, with ears set on the crossbars and a little mouse perched on the fierce feline's nose. Matthew deliberately sprang the mechanism, and the cat's sharp teeth dug into the flesh of his finger. We did as we must, my lord. We waited. We kept silent. We never lost faith that time would bring Madame de Clairmont back to us. A sad smile played at the corner of Hélène's mouth. If only Sir Philippe could have lived to see this day. At the thought of Philippe, my heart skittered. He must have known how badly his children would react to having me as a sister. Why had he put me in such an impossible situation? All right, Diana? Matthew gently laid his hand over mine. Yes, just a bit overwhelmed. I took up the portraits of Matthew and me wearing fine Elizabethan clothing. Nicholas Hilliard had painted them at the Countess of Pembroke's request. She and the Earl of Northumberland had given the tiny likenesses to us as wedding gifts. It was Madame Isabeau who found the miniatures, Hélène explained. She scoured the newspapers every day looking for traces of you, anomalies that stood out from the rest of the day's events. When Madame Isabeau saw these in an auction notice, she sent Master Marcus to London. It's how he met Mademoiselle Phoebe. This sleeve came from your wedding dress. Matthew touched the fragile fabric, tracing the outlines of a cornucopia, the traditional symbol of abundance. I'll never forget the sight of you coming down the hill to the village with the torches blazing and the children clearing the way through the snow. His smile was full of love and a pleased pride. After the wedding, many men in the village offered to pay Madame de Clairmont court should you tire of her, Hélène chuckled. Thank you for keeping all of these memories for me. I looked down at the desk. It's much too easy to think I somehow imagined everything, that we were never really there in 1590. This makes that time seem real again. So that's what it's really like to be a historian. Little bits and pieces that somehow allow you to connect to the past. And that was really one of the great pleasures of writing the whole trilogy, was hoping that even if you'd hated history before, or if you'd loved history before, it didn't matter, because somehow this world, this fantastic world of creatures and history and politics, would bring you into it and sort of absorb you and give you a nice soft place to land and characters to love at the end of the day. So finishing up with the trilogy, as you can imagine, has been a really kind of bittersweet experience for me, because I've lived with these characters now since 2008, so about 7 years, coming up on 7 years. And of course, what everybody is asking me these days is, well, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? So I will tell you what I'm doing right now. And what I'm doing right now is I am working with the BBC to bring an adaptation of the All Souls Trilogy to the little screen. So I hope that gets me off the hook for a little bit, because it's a great project. I'm really pleased to be working with the BBC. They're wonderful partners to be working with. They do a good job with book adaptations. They take reading really seriously, so it's a good thing. And fingers crossed, we'll have some more news for you a little bit later. Right now we're at that stage. It's called development. Really, what it's about is sitting around in lots of meetings where people say, in chapter 9, what was Diana thinking when she did X? You know, and it's been amazing to sort of sit down. It's like the ultimate book group, sitting down with a group of production people and trying to figure out what they want to do and how they want to do it and how they want to bring the story to life. In addition, I will write more fiction, as well, hopefully, as more history. I just don't know what it's going to be yet. Right now, I feel like my brain is full of squirmy puppies. It's the only thing I can really think of, where there's just this whole passel of puppies in my head, and they're running in all directions, and they're really cute, and everyone's adorable. And the minute I try to catch one of them, they kind of romp away like, ha, 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 and I chase it for a while, but I can't hold on to any one of them long enough. And I think that's probably just about a sort of a transition, you know, a writing transition. I think you know, one of the things that's a real challenge, of course, is that I want whatever it is to be really good and to be sort of worthy of you. And so I'm just going to wait until the right puppy slows down long enough for me to actually grab its tail or its by the neck or tickle its ears and get it to actually sit still long enough for me to get it onto the page and get it into your hands. And with that, I am going to just turn the microphone over to you because I'm sure you all have lots of questions and we want to have plenty of time for those as well as for getting our book signed. So thank you for being such a wonderful audience. And thanks again to Politics and Prose for hosting tonight. It's been great. Thanks. So just a reminder to use the microphones. And if you don't use the microphones, I'll end up having to repeat your question. So either way will work. Look, all right, so I'm a teacher, so I can wait here until the end of time for a question. Just so you know. Brave woman. Good for you.
Not a question as much as a comment. My daughter graduated from USC last year, and part of her graduation trip, we went to Prague.
Yay.
And it was so much fun going around all these places. She has not read the books. I don't know why. Maybe because she's a theater person, and so she's all involved with that. But we went up to the castle, and I'm like, oh, there's the moat, and here's that, and this happened there. So it was really nice seeing something from a book and connecting it with the reality of what it was.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. It's one of the things I actually, you know, I started out the books. They always say you should write what you know. Well, I was at Oxford for several years. I lived in upstate New York. I am a historian. I know libraries pretty well. We didn't spend a whole lot of time in Matthew and Marcus's lab in the first book, you might know. It's because I was all into the library. But what it happened was that it set this standard for description and knowledge of places that meant that it was not possible for me to like read a travel book on Prague and write the Prague part of the book of Shadow. So, you know, and I wrote, I knew that one of the few things I knew about Matthew Royden was that he was in Prague in March of 1591. It was one of the few facts I had about him. So I'm writing, I'm thinking, okay, pick up the pace now. And I'm writing, and I'm getting closer and closer. And I thought, I'm not going to make it. We're going to end up in Prague in the spring. And so I said, guess what? We're going to Prague. And so I went off to Prague and was there for 2 weeks doing research for that and lived in Prague and walked that road across the river up to every day. And one day I looked and I said, there's their house, you know? And so I had to because that's how I had written the parts on Oxford or upstate New York. So I'm glad you connected at that level. That was, it's a great way to have to do research. Usually I go to the library, lock myself in at 8:30 in the morning and don't come out until they kick me out. So to actually be in the streets and eat food was really exciting. Yes, ma'am.
So I've been fortunate to see you speak a couple of times, and I can't believe I've never asked you this question, but how did you come up with the name All Souls for the trilogy, beyond it being Matthew's College?
Great question. Good to see you again. So why All Souls Trilogy? So All Souls is something that plays on a couple of different levels. There's the college. There's the fact that really part of the point of the books is to emphasize that our similarities, that we're all souls that are equal, and that there aren't sort of the good ones and the bad ones and the marginal ones, but that we're all in this together. So that was a big part of it. And there's also another little twist that happens very close to the end of the book where we find out that someone was actually born on that day. So there's this kind of it was kind of like a little layered package of things that made it all work. But for me, probably the single most important thing was this idea that it was a book about everybody in this universe and the need to kind of see what joined us together rather than what made us separate. Great question. Thanks. Hello.
Hi. So a little bit about process and where it all bubbled up for you. My husband is absolutely convinced that I have books in me. I'm not entirely sure I believe him.
Okay.
So when did you know that you had fiction in you? Obviously you write, I would imagine, an immense amount for your their job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when did you know? How did you trust it? And how did you take that leap and...
That's a great question.
Get over that fear. I'm assuming there's some.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting question. I really never, I went through a phase, I think like all teenage girls do, especially if they've read Little Women, where they think they want, they want to write. And I wrote horrific Louisa May Alcott fan fiction. Do you remember the one with the flowers? Okay, so I came up with one that was like, 4 sisters, each one named after a different flower. One of them, really bad stuff, right?
And that's all available at auction.
But it really was horrific. And so then at that point, I think that was it. I never took a creative writing class. The last creative writing I did before Discovery of Witches was in 10th grade. And I wrote a short story about a Puritan girl's first day in the New World, which she spent largely up a tree, as I recall. And it was traumatic because I had been evading class. I did that a lot. And I had a pass, and I came in late, and my teacher was reading the story aloud to the rest of the class. And I hadn't talked to me about it. And I could hear my words before I got into the room. And I just thought, and that was, I didn't, that so I felt really exposed, and I didn't like that. And it's weird, I don't know how many other academic writers are out there. I don't feel exposed in academic writing because I have like this bulwark of evidence protecting me, right? So when I started writing A Discovery of Witches, I think at first I probably thought I was writing an op-ed piece on why are modern people so obsessed with the supernatural, like my research subjects in 1500 were. And then my kind of what ifs, and we'll imagine if, and well, okay, not everybody who was a witch would be happy to be a witch. Look at the history of it. It's not a good career path for women, and then so I was sort of okay, what if you didn't want to be a witch? And what if this, and what if that, and what if the other? And then at some crucial moment, people started talking to each other in these. And I started to write it down. I did not tell anyone, not even my partner, I was doing this for about 6-8 weeks. And I think it was 3 months before I let anybody read it. And I think it was Mom. And we went away for vacation. And I knew I might be onto something when Mom read through the first stack. And I was writing, and she had her hand in the door, taking pages as they came out of the printer. Now, admittedly, a biased readership. But I think that was when I was like, okay, maybe this is all right. And I was, I was 43. I didn't know. So my guess is a lot of us have stories in us. And what my hope is that maybe this encourages a lot of people who think, for whatever reason, because I write something else, or I can't, or I haven't done this, or I don't know how, just, if you've got a story to tell, just tell it, and just try to be okay with that. And good luck.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. Yes.
It was interesting you said the puppies, the squirming puppies, because at the end of book 3, I kind of felt like there was not loose ends per se, but more stories to be told. So I was wondering if one of those puppies might be some extension of some of those semi-stories that we got in book 3.
Philippe says that never is a very long time. So I would never say that I would never return to this world. I think my biggest challenge, frankly, is that, okay, so I'll give you for example. For me, the central character in the whole trilogy is Philippe. He's the axis around which everybody else moves. So I know where Philippe is, living or dead, for the entire timeline of the trilogy as we know it, which goes basically from Matthew all the way up to the present. I know where Philippe is at all moments in that. And that's a lot of information that's sitting in a file cabinet in my house, right? But I don't want to just give you more, right? I want to figure out how to tell you some of the stories I know and discover some of the stories I don't know in a way that's really satisfying. Mm-hmm. And I'm not quite there of figuring that out. I very well hope I will and may. But in addition, I think I've got other stories to tell you as well. So that'll be fun.
Awesome. Thank you.
So there's lots of puppies of many different colors and types. So that's good. Thanks. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you for making Stephen Proctor an anthropologist.
You are welcome.
I'm an anthropologist and an archaeologist by training. And I seem to recall that one of the places that Stephen Proctor time walked was Wyoming. Mm-hmm. And my specialty was Northern Plains archaeology, and I am dying to know if you know what time period he time walked to.
You know, I don't know if I know that.
I thought you might not, but
I don't. You know, and this always sounds kooky. It's like, why is the kooky author saying something like that? Of course she must know. I really don't. I think I was looking for places that had a sense of really deep spirituality and associated with them, like places that would really have resonated with him, thinking of how difficult it must have been. As Diana grew up, sort of knowing what he knew and foreseeing what he and his wife foresaw and what he would need during that. So I was sort of searching for these places that had real sort of spiritual presence and legacies. And that was one of the ones that, you know, my research led me to. But I don't know if I could pick an exact year.
That's fine.
But you could probably give me some ideas if I need them.
I play with that a lot.
Well, and that's again what I hope is so fun about it, is that those little sort of loose ends that the previous questioner asked about actually are places for your own imaginations to kind of play.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yes, over here.
Hi. With your BBC connections, do you have any actors in mind that you would love to have me play?
All right, you ready? Is everybody ready? I'm going to tell you. Good actors. I've been practicing that in front of the mirror for a couple of days now. But yes, good actors. I don't have, the question was about which actors I'd like to play the roles. And honestly, given how challenging it is, really seriously, for me to call a meeting with about 5 people, I don't know how you make a television series or a motion picture because of the amount of people who have to clear their schedules for the exact same period of time. But the one thing I know for sure is that the BBC is really good at casting. You know, so I remember back in the day when I used to watch the BBC America and watched a little show called Hexed about a haunted boarding school. And there was this guy in it. Nobody had ever heard of this guy before. And he was the principal, kind of demonic principal named, you know, Michael Fassbender, before he was Michael Fassbender. So I'm like really okay with the BBC just going for it and doing their thing. And I think it'll be really exciting to see. It's a very different kind of acting system and over there, and they get amazing people to play amazing roles. So fingers crossed. Keep you posted. Thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. Yes.
Hi. So I'm actually a science student studying genetics. So part of the book of life that I loved was the parts in the lab, and I thought it was so accurate, the types of people you see. Did you actually spend time in a science lab, and what did you think of that compared to the library then?
Okay, great question. I spent a little time in labs, but mostly I drew on, in a very weird way, what I knew about science labs from the past. And like I pulled Matthew Royden sort of into the future, I pulled certain kinds of historical researchers that I'd known into the future and wrote those scenes. And then I ran it by the very generous senior research fellow in my dean's science lab, who read it and talked to me about like what would work and what wouldn't work. And what we both laughed over was how much the types of characters had been consistent. Because she was like, so you've been in so-and-so's lab and seen X. And I'd be like, no. That was based on this historical figure from 1815. And she was like, oh my God, we have one of those, you know? So it was really great just to see how it stayed. But she was also wonderful because one of the things she said to me, Susanna Wong, that was so beautiful and so accurate was she said, you know, the things that are really, that you haven't got right is the language of science, that we speak our own language. And so part of what she did was to help me understand just that, you know, and how to talk about modern labs. And it was such a fun part of the research. What's really scary about it, though, is that my historical research really stays put a lot more than yours does, your form of research. So the things that were completely hypothetical, like the significance of non-coding RNA, when I started in 2008 versus where or the kind of weird, like, could we have mated with Neanderthals, are like, by the time I write the last volume, are in the scientific literature. It was the strangest thing. So I kept giving little theories to people, and then it was wonderful to see who was right by the end of the actual series. So thanks. I'm glad they work for you. I think we've got time for one more.
I have 2 questions.
Okay, we can do 2.
Okay. The first is, you mentioned fan fiction. So on one hand, that's a very great compliment that people want to write more and take your characters and make them live. On the other hand, you gave birth to them. They're yours, and also the legal aspect of it. So how do you really feel about fan fiction?
About fan fiction? You know what? Here's the thing. I think fan fiction has been around since time immemorial. I don't think that... I would hate for somebody to pretend to be me, i.e. I would not like fan fiction that was written under my name. But I think fan fiction is here. It's always been here. It's here to stay. And in a sense, if you're writing a book with a dark hero and a dark troubled hero and a heroine, we're all writing, you know, Jane Eyre fan fiction. in a way. And so, and people say, well, no, she's dead. And I'm like, actually, that doesn't get you off the ethical hook, right? It doesn't matter. So I think it's a really great, complicated question. I have to say, I don't venture into the world of fan fiction, in part because these characters are still really alive to me. And I need to be able to say, I have no idea what y'all are doing with Gallowglass. Go with God. You know, because in case I ever want to visit him again, I need to be able to actually, you know, be able to get up and say that. So, yeah.
The other question is, you know, you came into being an author of fiction and, you know, I don't want to say on a whim, but, you know, kind of unexpectedly. And come to this journey where now you have this, I don't know, I'm part of it, so I'll call it the cult following here, right? What's been the most positive, best part of that? And if there have been any negatives, drawbacks?
The most positive thing is you're all really wonderful people. And I genuinely mean that. I mean, so for those of you who, I have a Facebook page, and it's really me. It's really me twittering and putting out pictures of my luggage tag on Instagram, which is what I'm doing right now. It's, you know, I participate in the fan, there's a fan group on Facebook that is different from my page, which you're part of. And I love it. It just means like I have a really big classroom. Sometimes it's hard because you all have so much energy. And I get to the end of the day and I'm thinking, oh man, I'm going to have a glass of wine. And I look at my Facebook and there's like 300 things. I'm thinking, wow, what's going on? And I get on and then I get sucked into it. And then I'm thinking, oh, I'm just going to have a glass of wine and relax. But I mean, that's like me being stopped walking across campus to my car at the end of the day and having students who say, Professor Harkness, I just want to know, when Henry VIII did blank, and am I tired and thinking, oh yeah, I want my glass of wine? Yes. Am I totally thrilled and happy and high on that for hours afterwards? Absolutely, yes. So I don't really know if there can be a downside to having people read your work and like it. I haven't found it, if there is one, quite yet, but thanks for the question. All right. I think we should probably, if I didn't get your question, I'm right here, so you really can still ask me. But otherwise, should we sign? Oh, we have giveaways. I told you they'd like giveaways.
Yeah, they do. Oh my God, isn't she a total joy? Give her a round of applause.